Welcome back. I hope you're enjoying the show. Listen, I am super excited for our next guest. Live in the studio with us, we have Fatima Dicko. She'll be talking about the psychological impact of a vibrant community. You're going to be thinking about things that you're not thinking about in terms of access control. Fatima is the founder and CEO of Sugar. It's a venture-backed prop tech company turning apartment buildings into interactive communities. She's worked as a senior engineer on the Procter & Gamble product innovation team, focused on designing and building products 3 to 10 years away from market, so she can see where things are going. She is passionate about building products people actually love, the future of work, philosophical ideas surrounding automation, and the growth of non-consensus ideas. Now, you can be invited to join us here today with Fatima live in the studio. Welcome in, Fatima. Welcome in. So good to have you here.
Nice to chat, Patrick. I'm so excited about
Yes,
the event.
I have so much to talk about because you're getting me to think about things that are not so obvious around even technology and how it relates to communities. But and I've seen some of the things you guys are working on. You're turning what you call buildings into micro communities. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, you know, it's an interesting concept because if we just think about the name of where sugar came from, people have been borrowing a cup of sugar from their neighbors for a very long time. And it actually wasn't until, the Industrial Revolution, increased access to modern technology, transportation, and ultimately grocery stores, is when the need for interacting with neighbors started to decrease. And I think that when I think of, and the way our team has been thinking about interactive communities, it's both from a necessity standpoint of how do we better leverage the people who are in super close proximity to us, but then also a psychological impact, which I think is true now more than ever with what we're going through in isolation. But what are the implications scientifically of just micro interactions with people who live close by? So I'm super excited to dive into that today.
Well, as a founder and an innovator and getting so much sort of, I know you were just on CNBC the other day and a lot of momentum around the things that you're trying to solve for. How important is timing to all of this? Because it seems to me that building communities and even the psychological impact of keeping people connected and together, nobody saw COVID coming, but it's obviously timing is to your benefit. Talk to me about that.
Sure. I think, with technology companies, timing is so critical. When we think about YouTube, bandwidth inside the homes allowed, YouTube to exist. Uber, GPS on phones allowed that to, take off when it did. And I think with your earlier conversation with Nick, the conversation of Clubhouse came up. And I think that there are certain cultural phenomena, and in this case, it's isolation and, 1 in 4 people, Americans working at home, dwell time being at an all-time high, and most importantly, loneliness also, especially amongst younger demographics in urban areas. When we think of the implications of, what that's resulting in, this makes it a critical time to think about residential engagement and connectivity in ways we haven't before.
Yeah, you think of the lagging loneliness pandemic and activating those people inside those homes. I mean, we heard Nick even say that people were forced to be in the products that we serve, and we weren't really prepared to communicate and handle that. So let's back up the lens a little bit. Let's talk about you, how you got here, what you're working on, what you're excited about, because a lot of our viewers probably haven't heard from you before.
Sure. So a little bit of my journey. I was born in Mali in West Africa and grew up in New York City. Initially started, I'm a chemical engineer. I went to Columbia, and what drew me to that field was the ability and almost the necessity to always be asking questions, specifically why. And I think, to reference the conversation with Nick earlier, we always should be questioning, why have we been doing this a certain way? Why are, to that point, why are leases 12 months long? And so I think that led me to my first job at Procter & Gamble, where, as you mentioned, which is awesome, by the way, the bio earlier, developing products 3 to 10 years away from market. And when we think about, the process that one needs to take to create solutions that far out, you kind of need to look at two things, what's needed and what's possible, and then find the intersection between that. And I think that's where some really interesting innovation takes place. So I worked at Procter & Gamble for a while, learned from some brilliant people, folks who, inventors of products like Swiffer, Head and Shoulders. And one of the things my mentor told me there that led to a lot of what I'm doing today is, he said, great ideas happen when two old ideas meet for the first time. And that, it really stood out to me because it made me understand that, in entrepreneurship, especially, in these industries where legacy products have dominated the market for so long, you definitely don't need to be first. You just need to be different or better. And you need to quantify better in a way that the market can understand. And then you need to really quickly, create a feedback loop where you can iterate faster than larger companies can, because that's, the entire benefit of working in a startup. And so I left Procter & Gamble after 4.5 years. Brilliant place, amazing people. I went to Stanford Business School, and at the time I was building essentially a hyper-local Craigslist for college campuses. And we grew to 10 campuses around the country, and we thought a lot about how do you make it easier to connect with other students who are living on campus. And when campuses shut down during COVID, that put us in an interesting position as a company to think about, okay, what have we learned? Should we stop, keep going? What is now true, not only in the market we were looking at, but in some of these other markets? And can we potentially apply what we've been building there? And that's what led us to, building Sugar and being in this, what I think is such an interesting time in prop tech. It couldn't be a better time for us as a company, as an industry, and I'm pumped to be where we are now.
Yeah, so you mentioned, what things need and the possibilities. How are you seeing the possibilities around even the conversation around access control?
Yeah, I think, if we look at or we think about this goal of resident engagement, I think we need to also consider what are the ways in which companies have thought about resident engagement over the years and what's worked and what hasn't worked. I think that what hasn't worked is, the level of product stickiness and adoption that's necessary to actually get people engaging with one another. And when you think about product adoption, especially in the multifamily space, I think that there certainly needs to be a combination of utility and the community engagement. And by utility, I mean a reason for people to be in the app every day. Certainly the idea of paying rent once a month in an app is not frequent enough or, quite frankly, exciting enough to build a product.
Emotionally, it's like, oh, here goes.
Oh, man, I gotta, get in this app again and pay rent. But I think that, companies that are really able to hack product stickiness by attaching it to some necessity or making people's lives easier in some way or another, such as, in our case, the ability to unlock doors, then you open up, an entire suite of possibilities for, the gold attention span of people using your product, right? Because at the end of the day, with all these things competing for people's attention, it's almost impossible nowadays to build a consumer mobile app that reaches that level of stickiness. So that's how we, began with and put a stake in the ground about integrating with access control solutions so that people can not only unlock doors, but do things they weren't able to do before in the app.
Yeah, there's the airlines that have the physical assets and the flights and all that stuff. And then there's that other business that sits on top of it, the miles and the points and the gamification of all of that. sort of psychological, rewards, whatever you want to call it. Do you see multifamily having another layer of how we even value the asset itself?
Absolutely. I think, and again, to reference your conversation earlier, because I think there were so many points that both you and Nick touched on. I believe he mentioned a company gamifying paying rent. I think that there's the ability to gamify altruism in a way as well, and create, really awesome mobile experiences for not only interacting with neighbors, for, sharing digital keys, hosting events. And I think that products that tend to essentially create this, dopamine rush when you're rewarding what it is that you're trying to develop, I think that those are products that ultimately end up, becoming really sticky and then ultimately outstanding some of these other products.
Yeah, and they sort of look forward to interacting. And some of you look at what's happening even in sports, the movement to physical, to even online, and how they engage. And a lot of it's driven by the customer. What are you tracking in terms of the customer?
Yeah, certainly I think there are traditional metrics that, help to understand the stickiness of a product. DAU over daily active users over monthly active users, how frequently are people actually opening your product? The closer to 100%, the more frequently people are opening the app every day. And I think that, the way we're thinking about community engagement metrics it's very intentional and it's very empathetic, because I think while traditionally tech companies have looked at, engagement metrics and just trying to maximize the amount of time that people are glued to their phones, I think that it's something that, we need to be very cautious about. We need to activate engagement and provide value, but not fall into the trap that some of these other products have fell into. Because I do believe that software is going to shift from enabling productivity to enabling connectivity. So metrics that we're looking at, certainly there are the traditional metrics of, how actively are people using it, what's the time spent in the app. But then I think there are some of these more nuanced metrics around the impact of the engagement, with messages being sent to one another, events that are being attended, when are people going, are they adding them to their calendar? These sorts of things help you essentially widen your aperture into how that engagement is actually psychologically impacting a community.
Yeah, you think about amenities, and now, the tennis court to the fitness center to the clubhouses were designed to bring people together. Are you reimagining these things, and what do you see the future of amenities?
Sure. I think there are, there are a few different relationships that we have to consider when looking at multifam properties. You have the relationship, of a resident to another resident, the relationship of the resident to managers, and then the relationship between the resident and any of the amenities that are on site. Do the amenities require a third party? Are they more difficult to use than the benefit that you're actually getting? What's the cost? Is that bucketed into the rent? Is it something that I have to pay for each time? And so for us, before we start diving into these are the exact amenities and integrations that we want to plug into Sugar, we want to think about, what are the amenities that really truly do drive that, the value to the residents and that desire to come back home. Because at the end of the day, your home should be the place that you're most excited to go back to, and it should be, similar to when we go on vacations and we experience, all of these, the amenities and the vacation experience. I think people are starting to want those experiences at home. Yeah,
and I think about, just living through the life that we are using in the real world, and then we go to work, and in the multifamily industry, it's fragmented a little bit in how we expect customers. I mean, there's a lot of work and a lot of opportunity that you mentioned to be done. My question was around what you talked about in terms of having these touch points or these apps the app that kind of communicates and enhances this layer that probably people aren't even thinking about right now. How does that allow us to think beyond or even predict or understand just more data around this behavioral experience?
Sure. I think the way to think about what we're doing is the software that's sitting on top of different hardware components of modern buildings and enables things to take place that couldn't happen before. So if we think about the actual hardware and the access control solutions, that powers modern buildings, there's an opportunity to now serve as the software that allows you to, allows residents to share digital keys with maintenance request personnel, or, booking a cleaning and being able to attach a digital key, solving packaging, right? Something that I think has historically been broken for multiple different reasons. And, as I think about where we are going with our software, we're not only thinking about, obviously the core necessities of being able to unlock the door from your mobile app by plugging into this hardware, but also, what are the future experiences? One of our customers mentioned a need where, he has a ton of different properties, and some of the properties have certain amenities that other properties do not. And so how do we open up these amenities to people across the entire portfolio? So I think that there's a ton of ways in which, if you think about the two things building owners and managers care about the most, it's increasing asset value and minimizing vacant space. And I think with minimizing vacant space, for us, that's, there's a direct correlation between community engagement and lease renewal. In fact, a lot of studies show that if folks know, at least two people in their building, they're more likely to renew their lease. And so I think that, that's certainly one way to look at community engagement, but also with serving as the software that sits on top of the hardware, you can now track things such as, what percentage of my residents are using the gym? How frequently do they go? How is that impacting not only my resident satisfaction, but how is that impacting my Yelp and Google reviews? How is that impacting, my digital reputation, which is becoming more and more important in the industry? So I think there's a lot of different ways to look at that, and we're excited more than anything to continue tackling.
Yeah, so I look at my iPad here, and I have my audience like right in the screen. It's a little crazy. So the hardware, the iPad, and you mentioned like the software that runs. I'm now connected to a community with this, but if I'm getting, the deliveries, the pet walking, all that kind of stuff, that's the stuff you're talking about that is more psychologically interesting and more frequency, more touch points, where they actually, look forward to using that. That's been a lot of challenges, I think, before, is how do you get people to use the thing? But if you're embracing this, like almost like Apple does, with unlimited potential, how do you see the future of what goes into this software?
For sure. I think Apple's a really interesting example. You could think of a few different scenarios where the software has been able to, take the hardware to places it wasn't able to go before. If we think of the Apple Watch itself, if we think about that as, access control solutions, the hardware, and then we partner that with apps, software such as Strava. I don't know if you've used that product. That's essentially, a community app that uses, obviously plugs into your watch, allows you to, run with your friends, track each other's rides, join competitions, incentivize one another. And again, it's an awesome example of a software, a product that's sitting and integrating with this hardware and now allowing you to do things you couldn't do before. And so that's a big component of how we're thinking about it. Same thing, iTunes back in the day with, the iPod, you're able to use this software to, organize your music, create playlists. And so that's when we think about the Sugar software product that's sitting on top of these access control solutions, we want to, again, to Nick's point, be able to design features that have a very clear ROI to building owners and managers, but then also allow people to do some of these, these interactions that can't be measured as easily or can't be quantified, but still do enable, some of these connectivity, these, these closer connections to the people who are close by. And yeah, we're pumped about that.
Yeah, so let's talk about sugar now. Where are you on the journey? What kind of conversations are you having with multifamily operators today?
Sure. First and foremost, we're just trying to understand problems in the industry, before anything. And I think there's a big difference between features and benefits.
Sure.
In the startup world, it's always, are you designing a vitamin or a painkiller? And I think in the multifamily space, it's almost critical during the early days, or so we've learned, that you lead with a painkiller. The vitamin, is a nice to have, and ultimately may be the thing that leads to, increasing the asset value, increasing lease renewal. But I think that the painkiller component needs to be very, very clear up front, just because of, the budgets, the margins, these sorts of things. So we took some time to just talk to real estate investment firms, property management companies, owners, developers, and we just tried to understand what are the biggest problems. And when we looked at, I guess the 4 stages, right? The first is attracting new residents, getting them, to know about your property, want to live there, visit, and make a decision. The second is some of these operational tasks with, conducting background checks, getting people set up to actually sign the lease. The third is, ongoing collecting rent, dealing with maintenance requests, and essentially these day-to-day needs of the residents and doing it in cost-effective ways. And then finally, lease renewal. And so we thought that there was an interesting opportunity for this first area of attracting new residents and then also lease renewal. So when we looked at attracting new residents, we asked folks, where are your new residents coming from? How are they learning about you? What are your biggest challenges? And what we heard consistently was, our Yelp and Google reviews play such a big role, and residents only go there when they have a problem, when the Wi-Fi is slow, or there's some trash issue, or, there's like a one-off scenario. And more, over 80% of millennials now will go to Yelp or Google before making either a touring or a leasing decision for a property. And so that was a space where we thought, there could be an opportunity to link some of these powerful interactions in sugar, and directly tie them back to leaving, better reviews on Yelp and Google. And then another problem we saw on the later end around lease renewal was that there's no way for me to even gain a pulse on how engaged or happy my community is. If you ask 10 property managers or owners, they know resident engagement is important. They know, I need to host events. I need to, let me bring in, the taco truck. Let me bring in, some buildings will bring puppies in the lobby to relieve stress. So I know people have all of these great ideas, but at the end of the day, there's no quantifiable way to tie that back to, again, the lease renewals and the community engagement. And so for us, we thought, again, tying it, and not to focus too much on the metrics here, but what we've learned is that, if every single thing that we're doing, every feature has to tie back to a way for the building to understand how it's impacting their goals. And I think that's where a big opportunity is in the industry.
Yeah, are there brands that you're watching that are getting this right, and not necessarily in our industry? I mean, it could be in our industry, but is it the hotels? Is it other? I mean, you look at like in an Airbnb, and their community is limitless in terms of there is no physical real estate, really. And even what the hosts have done, and the reviews and the feedback and all of those things. I mean, do you ever see a situation where there's a balance of those reviews, that the residents are actually, partaking on a little bit more of the accountability to keeping the community?
Sure. I think 2 really great questions there. In terms of other industries and places where I think this is, a lot of cool innovation is happening, I think ed tech has been really interesting to watch with some products, Google Classroom, the way that you're able to look at certain pieces of data and understand how engaged certain students are, who are students that are potentially at risk of being disengaged, and using data to make informed decisions before it gets to a certain point. In our case, it's someone deciding not to renew their lease, right? So there are ways to not only identify people or residents who are unhappy, but also how do you continue to empower these evangelists and these, super engaged people in these apartments? These are usually the folks who, they're throwing a dinner night, they're throwing trivia night, they're hosting a barbecue on the roof, they're organizing a basketball game or surfing or golf. And so it's how do you make it easier for those people to do what they do and spread their magic throughout the building? And then also how do you intervene at the right time? So I think that, ed tech is an interesting space. I think your second question was around, I forget what the second piece was.
Well, just just what Airbnb has created a community of the accountability. When you rent even a hotel or reserve a hotel, the way the buying process is that you sort of have accountability over how you take care of the space. And even with Airbnb, I mean, there were probably some early people that were like, I'm not my home, they'll come in and damage it. And so there was more reviews like of both the host and the guest, kind of balanced out the ownership of, and then the host put a lot of special aspects into how they were rewarded for going above and beyond and creating that community, even though their community was from people they've never met. It was maybe like the community was in the comments,
right?
You know what I mean? It wasn't even in the actual physical connection.
Right.
So I'm just curious what you look at in terms of really enhancing that experience, with technology or just even paying attention to.
For sure, it's a great question, and in fact, there are studies that show when people are invested in or contribute to the well-being of a solution or a space, they're more invested in that particular thing. And so if you give people the opportunity to, answer questions for one another, not only does it alleviate and minimize the amount of time that on-site management needs to intervene, but it allows people to feel more connected and just take great pride in the community that they live in. And so I think that resident to resident, knowledge sharing, answering questions, that's critical. When we look at reviews as well, or complaints that people may have, it's not necessarily that people don't want to see any negative reviews. In fact, if you go on Amazon, sometimes if everything's a 5-star, you almost, you get a little skeptical. Yeah. Like, who are these people? Yeah. You almost want to see the 1-star a little bit. But what's interesting about those 1 stars or these bad reviews at these properties is how quickly are people responding to them. People are paying attention to that as well, because that also does signal, how engaged people are, how engaged management is, rather in, taking care of the needs of their community. So again, it's not that we want to eliminate any negative problems. We just want to make it easier for people, residents, to help one another, and for management to understand that there's a problem and intervene as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm. So moving into these operators, who is it you want to have these conversations with? Is it the technology team? Is it, the regional managers, the CEOs? Like who should take on this aspect? Yeah,
it has to be a collaborative effort across various areas of these companies. You have to first start from a technology standpoint. Again, to Nick's point, integrations are key. If you're not playing nice with the Yardies, Rent Cafe, it's going to be almost impossible to get into these buildings, not because people are not eager for new solutions, but the amount of time it's going to take just to onboard and, change the staff, train them from using one stack to another stack. it's too expensive, it's too complex. So you first have to understand the entire ecosystem of, what are all the products that a building is using, and where does sugar fit in that, in as seamless as a way as possible, so that there's actually value and there's not a disturbance to the community. So I think that's at the forefront. Then, you have to talk, from the CEO to on-site management, because on-site management, they're going to be the evangelist of the product. They have to not only know how to use it, but be excited about using it and integrate it into all of the things that they're doing. And so to get into the mindset of what they're doing on a daily basis and how we can be, as little of a pain as possible, and more importantly, solve problems for them. I think that makes the conversations with the CEOs a lot easier. In our case, we wanted to go to the CEOs and the people at the top last, even though, they're the decision makers, and ultimately, this top-down, distribution across portfolios is, how it usually happens in the industry. But starting there wouldn't give us an understanding of exactly how the product not only needs to be built, but needs to be integrated into these properties. So that was, how we thought about it early on. And, to answer your question more directly, it has to be this collaborative effort in order to see the true innovation that we need. And that's just within the ecosystem. I think we also have to think about other products and apps and really cool solutions that have been created, but haven't gotten the opportunity to get integrated into products in the multifamily space, either due to closed APIs or, just not asking the question of why, not exploring what the future of residential life could look like. And so it has to be a collaborative effort there.
Yeah, and that goes with, I think, any product, really. And so tell me more. I want to dive into more about really where sugar fits into that ecosystem. How would you highlight that?
Sure. As we think about this as a B2B2C play, selling directly to the owners, the managers, but then ultimately having the consumers be the ones who are engaging with the product, you have to think about that translation of, how am I doing well as a business, things like the ARR, the growth, but then ultimately, how am I doing well, from an engagement standpoint with the residents. And so for us, we rolled out with a few pilots and we started measuring. It actually started with a QR code in my apartment in Los Angeles. And within a few days, we had over half of the building engaging on the platform. So we just started to dive into that and we said, okay, why are people using this? What else is in the industry? Why are people not using this? And why aren't there better apps out there for residents? And we found that the integration to these other systems are critical. And so where we stay, we are the interface with the resident, but then behind the scenes, we can integrate with these other technologies that management is using, either to, track and analyze finances, look at lease renewals, collect rent. So the resident never knows about these other systems. They're just, experiencing sugar,
Sure.
Enjoying their experience, playing with, experimenting with the features that we've presented to them. But on the back end, we're not requiring managers or owners to adopt an entire new system for rent collection or maintenance requests. So we are the digital layer and the direct interface with the resident. And then behind the scenes, there are all these other companies that are doing phenomenal things. I think rent and maintenance requests will come a very far way over the next, 2 to 5 years. And so being able to play with these other systems and not necessarily vertically integrating and owning everything, but fitting in where we think we can deliver the best experience. And for us, we think that is, the community engagement piece and the direct interaction with the resident.
Yeah, and we launched live. I just said, text me on this Innovation Advisory Council. I'd love to have you join me there, because I think that that you mentioned the feedback loop. There's some pretty interesting conversations I'm sure that operators would be able to, well, what about this? And what, like, the ideas are out there, and to the extent that we can get them to you, who has the skill and the backing to actually accelerate and move these things into, the residents actually experiencing them. It's let's see, Jameson asks, how can I get my company involved? So, good question. I'm sure you want to answer that question. We'll give you some information on how to get access to sugar directly. Let's see here. Oh, that's a question maybe we can ask. Are these being recorded? Yes, we'll be able to get people. So, what are the investors? I mean, is this a conversation that's goes even higher to the people that are financing and thinking about, what does that customer of the future look like? How do we maintain them? And because they're looking at reducing risk, but also getting the upside, is this a conversation for investors?
Absolutely, and as we gear up to close our funding round, which we're excited to announce shortly, we have some really awesome players in the prop tech space that are going to be phenomenal partners. We certainly cannot do this alone, so we're excited about that. I think a lot of the conversations that we've had as investors were assessing our company is that during times like this where the market is ever evolving and the possibilities are endless, but also the future is relatively unknown. You could look at the market and some of the past data points around residential apps and who's done well, who hasn't done well, what about, the graveyard of companies that have tried to embark in this area, but that'll give you a certain data set. And so a lot of our investors that ultimately ended up joining the round, they called our early customers and they asked, why are you using sugar? Why are you paying for sugar? And they spent more time. Certainly they got to know the team, the product, and, they already had a wealth of understanding and information about the market itself. Mm-hmm. But I think what ultimately resulted in some of the more interesting conversations and ultimately their participation in the round are these conversations with our customers. And so, again, what are the problems and why are you using this? Resident engagement, it's almost gotten this soft and fluffy connotation of,
nice to have,
it's this vitamin. Right, and things like water leaks.
Right, yes, leak detection.
Yeah,
not a problem now, but
right, could be a huge problem. Like that painkiller, right? Yeah. But to this point of, the biggest expense for buildings, apartment turnover. And so talking directly to our customers and asking, why are you using this and how will you measure whether or not it's successful? I think mm-hmm. that was very helpful during the early days, especially as an early startup where, there's some really big players in the space that have done, really cool work and have, paved the way for a lot of the new products that are going to emerge in the industry.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier, we touched on it a little bit and started off with sugar, the name, right?
Yep.
This idea of, because I think, I don't know if people are doing that as much because maybe they don't have the technology, right? Or they're back to their own, personal, that isolation period, right? They've been, especially in the COVID pandemic. What do you see in the future of this sharing economy? Because this could unlock everything with a platform like that.
Sure. I think, the concept of borrowing sugar, is not only, certainly, historically, there was a necessity component to it, saving money, being more efficient. But I think there's this other psychological component as well of, when we go to ask someone to borrow something, it's also about that social capital and the increased connectivity we now feel with that person. And so, we've seen, even in some cases, there were residents who had dogs and then met other residents who had dogs. And because their dogs formed a squad, one person didn't want to break the lease because they didn't want to break up the dogs, right?
Oh, wow. That's a whole other level.
So there's some interesting dynamics around
pet engagement.
Pet engagement, yeah. I'm sure there's a pet engagement app somewhere that someone is tackling. But to answer your question about the future of borrowing and these marketplaces, when we think about turning buildings into micro communities, you think about a micro community, there's sort of a, self sustainability component to it, right? And sharing with one another, and then removing the barriers that make it difficult to share with one another. So let's say I'm not in town, someone wants to borrow my golf clubs or my speaker or my air mattress. I may feel comfortable sharing a digital key with them and allowing them to now have access to items that I have not only when I'm at home, but during the entire time of me living at that property. I think certainly Airbnb is a great example of that. I think that there's tons of other opportunities to do that with the items that are directly in your home. I think in any apartment, there's surplus and there's deficiency with needs. There's always someone cooking something and made, some extra. There's someone who may be busy, startup founder who, would really enjoy just a meal with some other people in the building. So I think removing the barriers to connecting people, making these marketplaces that are not, I don't know if you've experienced some of these apps, not only in multifamily, but just these marketplace apps in general. Sometimes you'll just see a giant feed, someone selling a pot. That's like the first thing you see. It's like, I don't need a pot.
Right.
And, it's not efficient. It's usually geared around selling, but there's very little innovation around rentals, right? And what does it look like to, share sports equipment? What does it look like to share things that you may only need for one day? What does it look like? And I know it's probably happened, bikes, wine openers, if you forgot, that's happened to so many people, where you're like, you have a dinner party over and you can't find the wine opener, right? So how do you make it less awkward? How do you make it easier? And then how do you, allow people to give access to items when they may not be home? And I know that sounds like a crazy idea, but I think we're going to get more and more desensitized to giving people access into our units over time.
Yeah, that's interesting. Fascinating stuff. What am I missing? What should I be asking I'm not asking? Because I know that you're having these conversations and with operators, and sometimes we come with the frame of mind of what is, and you're living in this space and even trained professionally and for big groups thinking in advance. What should we be asking around this type of product, I guess? Yeah,
I think, we should first ask, why is this different or better than other resident engagement apps that have been out there? And I think we certainly touched on that, in that we're integrating with hardware products to really allow people to have a reason to go in the app every day. So, the engagement features are only as good as the amount of time that people are in the app. So I think that's one question, how are we different? I think the second question is, what have been the barriers that have prevented innovation in this industry over time? What are things that, will continue to exist, and what are things that will change over time, right? And so when we think about this as a team, we're thinking about obviously right now and our customers today and, the value that we deliver to them from day one, but we're also thinking about, what is an apartment building going to look like 10 years from now? How are people going to be interacting? Are these going to be, these micro cities, these micro hubs, turning any building into a community? Are people going to be living in an apartment for 12 years at a time? Are they going to move around and spend, 1 month in one building, one month in another? But I think independent of a lot of those changes, what will always be true is the need to connect with other people. So the ability to plug into a building, whether you're there for a year or you're there for a month, and engage with the community is something we're fascinated about. I think, the pandemic has certainly caused us to think about human connectivity in a completely different way. I think that a lot of really powerful innovation will come out of this, but there's also a lot of stuff we need to repair. And I think multifamily plays a big role in repairing those lost connections during the pandemic. And, you know, what an exciting time, right? What an exciting time for the industry. So very excited about that.
Wow, those are some refreshing thoughts. Are you, do you get on the whiteboard, or you scope all these things out, or what's
All
your
the
style
time.
of thinking, I guess? Or,
Yeah, you know, I think I'm a very lateral thinker. I like to think big but act small.
okay.
And so, you know, a lot of times, and there's multiple people on our team who have whiteboards, and we'll have like whiteboarding sessions. And, you know, I think the key is always going lateral and then bringing it linearly and figuring out, okay, here are all the things we can do, but what should we do today?
Right.
And then building a roadmap around that. And so, you know, that's the beauty of a startup. You get to do both,
Right.
which are exciting, and you get to switch between the two. You certainly have to be very selective about the features that you work on and what you build, but I think that only increases the pace of innovation and you know, building the right things, solving problems. And this is a really exciting industry because everything almost needs to be attached to some ROI. So teams almost, that discipline needs to be baked in from day one in order to think about these features. You can't just, you know, build. There's a ton of cool stuff
Right.
we want to be able to build, and hopefully we'll get a chance to tackle a lot of those things. But during the early days, you know, we have to be very bullish and disciplined about that ROI piece.
Yeah, and I know we talked about it earlier, but, you know, not just innovate or change for the sake of it, but really who benefits from that. And as a founder, keeping that, you know, at the heart of knowing, like, this product you're bringing to the marketplace is going to, A, improve the life of the customer you serve and create stickiness, all that kind of stuff. But also, you know, there's financial senses. There's a business case to this. It's not just resident engagement. Like,
Right.
there's a strong business case with that. And companies that don't, you know, stick around and you've continued to evolve, have a good relationship, you know, with the customer. And if the customers are having good relationships with themselves, then
Right.
that's even better. Like, that's a huge win. But
Right.
gosh, any final thoughts you want to leave our viewers with? This has been a refreshing and amazing time together. Always excited to spend time with innovators in the world.
Thank you. This was awesome. I love the questions and the conversation. I think the last thought that I have is, you know, while it's been a very devastating time in the world for several reasons, you know, it's also a time to rethink a lot of the ways that we've been doing things across a lot of, you know, different industries. I think multifamily is one where we should all be rethinking how things have been done and reimagining what things could look like, and the role multifamily plays, again, in establishing connections that have been lost. You know, I think there's a societal responsibility as well as we think about that. And again, it's, you know, what an exciting time to be in prop tech. So I love this conversation. I love everything you're doing with this summit and bringing folks together to have these dialogues. I think it's phenomenal.
Yeah. Well, thank you for coming in. I know that we'll do more. And if you can stick around after the show, I do have a whiteboard, and we have some really
I saw
fun
your
stuff.
whiteboard. I was like reading it. There's so many cool stuff on it.
Yes. So, yeah, I would love to stick around and have you hang out in the studio. And yeah, so thank you
Awesome.
so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thanks, Patrick.
All right.